Hey there, welcome back to Geeky Greenhouse. In today's video, we'll be talking about cracked tomatoes and how you can prevent it. So I love growing tomatoes. It's one of my favorite crops to grow every year, but they do have a fatal flaw, and that is that many of them will split just before they ripen. So today I want to talk all about how this happens and how you can help prevent it in your plants. Okay, so there are two forms of cracking. They're known as radial cracking and concentric cracking. Radial cracking basically comes down from the top of the tomato and sort of shows up as splits, sort of looks like a spider, whereas concentric cracking are rings formed around the top of the tomato. Radial cracking is more serious than concentric cracking and can lead to unusable tomatoes. But I first want to say that cracked tomatoes are definitely still edible. It can invite in pathogens, so you will want to harvest them early. As soon as you see some cracking, you should get them off the plant. But now let's talk about what causes cracking tomatoes. What it comes down to basically is a watering problem. And basically what it is too much water, especially while the fruits are getting closer to ripening. Now, to avoid this problem, you want to avoid overwatering your tomatoes, so you want to have good drainage for your plants and make sure that you don't allow your plants to go through a serious drought. So you don't want your tomatoes to get to the point where they're drooping their leaves before you water. And if they do, make sure that you don't dump water onto your tomatoes. You don't want to water too much at that point because that's when the plant is most vulnerable. Basically what happens is the water rushes back up into the plant and into the developing fruits, causing them to swell, and that causes the skin around the fruits to break. Older fruits are much more vulnerable as the skin tends to be more thin as you're reaching ripeness. So that's why it usually tends to happen on fruits that are just reaching ripeness, just when you don't want it to happen. Instead, what you want is for the plant to always have the water on board that it needs. The plant should always have water throughout so that it's not going through this drought phase and then filling back up with water and then drying out again. That's why consistent watering is so important. By the way, consistent watering not only helps with cracking fruit, but it also will help prevent blossom end rot. A lot of people think that blossom end rot is caused by a calcium deficiency, but really it has more to do with watering again, in that inconsistent watering can prevent the calcium from reaching the fruits that are developing, causing unformed skin and blossom end rot. So the most important thing by far is just to get on a consistent watering schedule. Don't water too much, don't water too little, and if you live in a place where it rains frequently, pay attention to the weather forecast. Most tomatoes like about 1 inch of water every week, like most crops in the garden, but as your plants get larger or if it's hotter, you may need to water more frequently, so take all of those things into consideration. We have a guest. Hey girl, can you tell us about cracking tomatoes? So besides getting on a consistent watering schedule, what are some of the other things we can do to avoid cracking tomatoes? And number one is to pick the fruits as they ripen. Don't let them sit on the plant too long. Once they change color, it's a really good time to get them off the plant. That way, you're going to avoid those possible vulnerable moments. If you get an unexpected rain, or if you just water your plants a little bit too much, those perfectly ripe tomatoes yesterday may be cracked the next day. And in a similar vein, you want to pick off fruits that are nearing ripeness before a heavy rain. So again, pay attention to that forecast, and if you see that a heavy rain is coming, pick off any fruits that are near ripe or ripe on the plant. Another thing I mentioned already is drainage. In potted plants, you really don't have to worry about this too much, but if you're growing in the ground or if you're growing in a raised bed, you should definitely make sure that your soil drains well. If you have heavy clay soil, then that soil tends not to drain as well, so amend some compost into it. You might even want to add something like a little bit of sand or something else to improve drainage. And lastly, plant varieties that are resistant to cracking. Some varieties are just more susceptible to cracking, especially the heirloom varieties that have lots of wrinkles. Those tend to get that radial cracking and they can be really unsightly. At the same time, it's really important to have tomatoes that are flavorful, that you'll actually use in the kitchen, and some of the varieties that are resistant to cracking are not the most delicious because they're hybrid varieties that have been developed to not crack, potentially at the expense of flavor. So while I think you should do most of these things to avoid cracked tomatoes, I think it's equally important to have some tolerance for cracking tomatoes because, like I said, they are definitely edible. You'll probably want to cut away the sections that have cracked because they are vulnerable to the elements, to pathogens, to mold. So while the small cracked section may not be good to eat, the rest of the tomato is most likely fine. If you'd like to see a list of crack-resistant varieties, we have an article down in the description below where you can get seeds for those varieties. And I recommend trying at least one just so you know that you'll have some tomatoes that won't be cracked in the event that you can't control a heavy downpour. Let me know if you have any tips or tricks for avoiding cracked fruit. No one really likes having a cracked tomato. Even though they're still edible, they don't look great. So please share down in the comments and we'll see you next time.